and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki Hong, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low or risky cases. We are very lucky to have our firm's another senior associate, Jiyae Hwang, who has a very high reputation in the E-2 visa world as the speaker for this webinar. I'll be covering the first half of our presentation and Jie will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our work with the E2 visas. We have built a strong reputation in this area, and we have processed hundreds of E2 visas, and many of them were high-risk cases. And we have worked with the U.S. consular offices all over the world. The one particular reason for this, our focus on this E2 visa was because our firm was established on an E2 visa by our firm's founder, Ian Scott himself. That's why we know a lot about E2 visa world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you could download guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to the webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link where you can sign up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any reason, please, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So, what is E2 visa requirements? E2 visa is basically it's based on a treaty agreement between the United States and a foreign country. And currently, United States have signed agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, but not that often, like every few years. A few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from the country. So for example, you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States yet, but let's say you later immigrant to Canada. And if you have a Canadian passport right now, then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must have at least 50%, half of the E2 company's ownership. The corporation type does not really matter, but we usually recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types of giving you very simple and clear supporting document for your E2 visa application purpose. You could also have a business partner. For example, if you are Canadian and your business partner who owns the other 50% of the company has an Italian passport, then your business partner can also apply for the E2 visa. So based on one business, two people can apply the E2 visas. But you have to make sure that you are able to maintain at least 50% ownership. And this requirement continues when you renew your E2 visa later. So you should consult with an immigration attorney whenever there is any change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is a substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about in more detail later, but generally speaking, it means sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. For example, if your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required funds to establish and start the business are less than a manufacturing facility. However, can you claim that your consulting company only need $5,000 to make a fully operational? Not likely. To meet the like standard review uh, by the consular officers and satisfy the eligibilities and review standard, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business type. I'm sure Jia will address this issue in more details later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. Fund must be at risk. It means the wire transferred investment fund must be used and spent. For example, you transferred $100,000 to the E2 business account. Then you need to spend the money to obtain all kind of necessary stuff, including office lease, office equipment, other professional accounting marketing services. Then you will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount of the fund out of $100,000 in your V2 visa application. So point is, the money transferred to your corporate bank account must be used. The next one is the source of funds should be satisfied. Any legit source can be used, but please keep in mind that government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentation. So you should try hard, keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how funds were originated and came to the E2 business account. How much is enough? Again, the same topic we will talk about more detail in next slides, but generally speaking, we recommend you to invest and spend at least $50,000. Typical E2 expenditures. So this bullet point is to show you how you should spend your investment for the E2 visa application. You do not want to spend like several $100s for the beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim it as a business expense. In real life, yes, you could claim it for your company tax deduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for the E2 visa case. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office rent, marketing, business entity setup. These are the most preferred and common expenses for your E2 visa case. The next slide. Next requirement, business cannot be marginal. This is the whole point why US government is giving out the E2 visa to foreign nationals. E2 visa is supposed to create jobs and contribute to the local economy in the United States. So if E2 business is barely making income for the just cover E2 investor and his family members' living costs, then obviously government would not like it. So therefore, you should keep in mind that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire US employees. You could even hire an employee before you apply for the E2 visa application, submit the visa application. So such would actually strengthen your E2 visa case. If you think your investment amount is low, and it may be good strategy to hire a US employee before the visa application. Business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you submit your E2 visa application, your business must be already fully ready to operate and already up and running by hired US workers. Okay? Or, so either it should be already fully ready or it is already operating by somebody in the United States. To prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit a signed commercial lease, business entity, the proof that business entity has been established and registered, and company website has been created, and contracts with the customers, any licenses if it is necessary. Next, you will solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. It simply means you are coming to United States only for your E2 business. So your E2 business is basically your full-time job. You should not driving Uber as a side hustle or just become passive shareholder of your E2 business. You should be actively participating in the E2 business's daily operations. But just one practical tip about this element is that when you submit your application to USCIS, they are already concerned to see if you are actually performing all kind of services by yourself without any employees. Because such would be direct competition with against the local labor market. So if you are running your E2 business too long without any employees, you should consult with an immigration attorney to carefully develop and design your E2 visa application. The next, you should maintain an intention to return to your home country upon expiration of E2 visa. Please note that E2 visa is not a green card or does not automatically lead to a green card. It only allows you to enter the United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. It does not mean that you cannot renew E2 visa or obtain US permanent residency later. You are allowed to renew it, and eventually you may go after US green card, but you should carefully develop the green card case direction with an immigration attorney because it doesn't allow your dual intent to have a permanent residency in the United States. The next one is a few options for the starting point. You must start a brand new business or buy existing business. Or you can sign into franchise agreement. But we'll talk about the considering buying business right now. So when you're considering buying existing business, you should consider that business has already good number of employees. The reason that again is that having existing employees before your visa application submit is a really good point, plus point. And when you buy the existing business, you can set up the escrow arrangement, which is really good protection for your transaction. Is that because if the transaction, your E2 visa application does not go through, let's say unfortunately your E2 visa application is denied for whatever reasons, then escrow arrangement with the sellers will protect you to have all the fund you paid to be returned. That's why escrow arrangement for the buying a business is very critical and important protection for your E2 visa application. The contract language in this agreement will usually protect you, but I want you to carefully review the contract, the transaction contract with the commercial attorneys and immigration attorneys together so that you can carefully review and sign the contract. Next slide. How long is E2 visa valid? It depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and foreign country. And it could be very short, like 3 months. It could be maximum 5 years. But even if you get 3 months over E2 visa, it does not mean you will be allowed to run your business only for 3 months. Regardless of your visa validity duration, you will be typically to get 2 years of E2 status when you come to the United States. The CBP at the airport will give you an I-94, which will stay your authorized stay as E2 status inside the United States. And regardless of how many years or how many days left on your E2 visa, you will usually get 2 years of duration of stay. So when your E2 visa is already expired because it's very short, or even if it's very long, it's already expired, then you will simply need to go out from the United States. If you have your E2 visa validity remaining, you can simply just come back and just renew the I-94 duration again. If your E2 visa is already expired, then you will need to reapply for your E2 visa again. Next slide. The regulation, how much investment is enough? Again, so the regulation do not specifically state the minimum investment amount for the E2 visa. As you know, the EB5 requires a minimum investment, like $800,000, but E2 does not have such requirement. This means you could get approval even with $50,000, depending on the type of business. More importantly, you need to show the amount is enough to make the business fully operational. So again, it should be looking reasonable to the government officer. Okay, so the whole point of making E2 visa application uh, to the U.S. government is that your invested fund, regardless of how much money, was enough to make the business fully operational. That's why we usually recommend investing at least $50,000 to meet the government officer's review standard. Sometimes government applies what is called proportionality test. Okay, this usually comes in very large investment, like $1 million, for example, pharmaceutical factory. In that case, well, you do not need to spend 100% before you apply. But since we are talking about smaller and riskier investment in our presentation, I would generally say proportionality test does not really apply. For the small businesses, it is usually better if you spend 100% or close to 100% of invested funds before you submit the application. If we are buying a business, you may wonder what counts as a substantial amount. Then usually it is fair market value. To find out, you may how much is fair market value of the business that you are going to buy. You may hire a business appraiser to get an evaluation report, but usually it's not required. Next slide. So what are some strategies to deal with the low investment amount? Your E2 case, if your E2 case is kind of weak because your investment amount is not much, then you may want to strengthen other aspects of your case. Again, the hiring a U.S. worker before you submit the application is probably one of the best steps you can take. Another thing you can do is show your E2 business already has demand from potential clients or business partners in the United States, such as a signed contract or MOU, letter of intent from potential clients can be very helpful. Okay? You can also get a letter from a local chamber of commerce where your businesses will be located. Such letter would help to show that your E2 business will create jobs and provide value to the community. This kind of support can make a difference in low investment case. Okay. Business plan is also one of the required documents. A strong business plan shows your marketing, your competitive strategy, and projected revenues, how many employees you will you're going to hire over the next 5 years. Those kind of presentation in the business plan is very important. And if you make a very strong presentation in the business plan, obviously will help your case. A CPA letter can be sometimes also used. This type of letter basically says the accountant has reviewed about the financial investment amount and projected financials. Based on their experience, the investment amount is sufficient to operate the business. So getting a letter from a third party like a accountant, certified accountant, is obviously helping your case where investment is low. You could be more creative to strengthen the low investment case, but these are the typical ways we recommend. What are some common E2 visa expenditures? So this slide is about the list of the expenditures we recommend that you spend. Okay, again, like I previously mentioned about having a dinner with a potential E2 investor. Another investor is not a good idea for your E2 visa application purpose. And these are the lists that we recommend to spend. Basically, when you establishing your the how much money you spend, the exact expense could be kind of vary depending on your type of business. Some businesses need to spend money on more money on inventories. Some businesses need to spend more money on like marketings or website. Depending on your type of business. But this list should give you general idea of where your investment funds are should be usually spent. Uh, One important point to remember is that while these are generally considered as a good expenditures, we do not recommend concentrating all of your spending on just one or two categories. Okay, let's say you are a consulting business and you spend maybe $5,000 in website and computer equipment. You have no way to find any other categories to spend the money. Okay, then I'm gonna spend the rest of my $40,000 paying my rent fees so that I can pay my rent fee like 1 year amount of rent fee in advance. Not a good idea. Okay, point is you should take a look at this list of expenditures in this slide. You try to spend the money on every categories in reasonable amount. Okay. Okay, with that in mind, let's turn it over to Jiyae, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation. She will cover how to wisely spend the money to improve your E2 visa case and how to overcome some common challenges. So please stay tuned.
All right, thank you so much, Yogi. All right, so let's go into a little bit more detail about what are strong expenditures versus what are some weak expenditures that you may want to avoid for an E2 visa application to maximize the chance of success. So, what are some weaker expenditure types? So, as Yogi mentioned earlier, expenses such as incidentals, such as, having a meal with your potential business partner or things like travel costs and flights. For example, if you came to the United States to investigate investment opportunities and you're trying to charge the airfare as part of your E2 investment, we do not recommend doing that. Um, Travel to and from the US to set up the business are usually not considered as part of the investment as we define it. Similarly, a car or a vehicle, purchasing a car or a vehicle can also be a very weak type of expense to include in an E2 visa application. In limited circumstances, it can work. For example, if the type of business requires a business-specific transport vehicle, such as if you're a cleaning service or if you have to transport heavy machinery as part of your business, or if it's a lawn mowing company and you have lawn mowers that you need to transport on a daily basis. And let's say if the car is stamped with the company's logo and things like that, that could be another question. But generally, we would not include the cost of purchasing a car if it's just for transporting the owner to and from the office. Um, in addition, even if you are including a car or a vehicle, as Yonggi mentioned in the previous slide, we do recommend combining that type of expense with substantial other varieties of spending as well. So if the main part of your application is just this one big vehicle that you buy, that would unfortunately not pose a strong case that everything related to setting up the business has been secured. Um, Meals, we already went over meals, transportation, not only flights, but if you spend on taxis or other, train tickets or things like that, we would similarly not include them. Entertainment is also another example where we would exclude as part of your file. And the last category of weak expenditures to go over, and we surprisingly encounter this a lot, are expenses paid to related parties. So, for example, if your brother is a web designer and you pay your brother $20,000 to design your website for your business, we're not going to include that $20,000 as part of your E2 investment for obvious reasons. Another risky practice is paying yourself through other companies that you own. So that if you do something like that, then really the reality of the situation looks like nothing really took place, not a bona fide transaction. So we would not include purchases like that as part of the investment amount. All right, so we'll go on to the next slide and let's talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses in particular. And we do get this question a lot from prospective clients and our clients. And really, one of the common questions that we get is, I have nothing to spend on because for a consulting company, you can just have, your home office and a laptop to talk to clients with, and I don't need anything else. I spend everything that I need to start a consulting business. What else do I need to spend money on? So theoretically, a very low investment for business purposes may be needed to start a consulting business, but for E2 visa purposes, you do have the burden of proof to demonstrate to the government that you are fully committed in a serious way to successfully operating the enterprise. So, unfortunately, you will need to spend more than what is practically required to start a consulting business. So the recommendation is to spend at least $50,000, as you mentioned in some of the previous slides. In addition, you can have some money reserved in the banking account as working capital, but we do recommend that a large portion of the money that you use for the E2 investment be actually spent on concrete expenditures. And we went over in the previous slides on what are some strong and weak expenditures that you can potentially count towards that visa purpose. In addition, really the investment amount depends on the consulate that you are applying at. So let's say you're applying in some consulates in Japan, which are used to seeing very large companies applying for E2 visas. You may want to spend a little bit more money than what we would recommend for different consulates that is more used to seeing smaller businesses. So really the strategy is very tailored. Make sure to speak with your lawyer to strategize on exactly how much money you would spend to set up your business. One other thing to mention is if you are applying for a change of status to E2 from within the USCIS, within the US, sorry. If you're in the US on a different status, such as F1, for example, and you want to change status to E2 based on a enterprise that you're setting up, USCIS may be more open to smaller investment amounts. So even if you spend like $40,000 on setting up this consulting business, for example, that may be enough. So definitely the venue is a very important consideration when we speak of investment amounts. So some other challenges and solutions we can consider is one thing we can do is to submit articles from industry outlets that show how much it costs on average to get that type of business up and running. And you can point out that you have spent much more than that. That's one of the ways that we use to help this argument. And as we mentioned before, consider spending more money than what is strictly required to, have the basic setup for the business. You can also consider spending on things that you normally wouldn't have spent yet at the initial stages of the business, but you can front those costs in anticipation of some of the things that you may need in the future. So, for example, even if your business is currently small and you only would require a laptop for yourself, if you foresee that you will be, hiring 2 more employees in the future in that year, then you can prepay for those pre-purchase those laptops that the employees will be using. So that's one example of fronting costs that will, eventually be used for the business in the future. The same goes with a business lease for your office. Even if you only need a month-to-month payment, you may be able to front the cost for the full year or front the cost for 6 months if you want to show that commitment to the business and increase the amount of money that you have spent. Because we would typically only, include money that you've already spent in the investment schedule. Future commitments we do not include as part of the money that you've already spent, so you can prepay for those the business lease costs if you want to boost up your investment amount. Similarly, even if you would necessarily not have spent money on things like this, if it helps to design a robust website, if it helps to hire a PR firm to really ramp up your marketing for the initial stages of the business, you can definitely consider spending money on that. So we don't recommend spending money just on things just for the sake of spending money. It would be ideal if you actually think about what your business may need reasonably and front those costs. And in that way, you would get a higher investment expenditure amount, but also be helping your business in the long term. Finally, it is the recommended strategy for us to have you spend money on a wider range of items rather than concentrating your expenses on one single thing. So even if and I've talked about this in the context of a vehicle, but even if you buy an expensive vehicle, and even if that's related for the business and needed for the business, you want to combine that with the widest variety of expenses that you can combine as possible. So office space, equipment, investing in marketing, hiring employees, and any salary that you pay to employees can be included as part of the investment amount. And any costs of setting up the payroll and paying, accountants or people to set up the infrastructure. You can also add in the investment amount. Really, it is key to spend over a large number of categories that will make it convincing to the officer that everything that is necessary for the business to be up and running has indeed been secured. All right, so we will move on to the next slide. Now, there are particular categories of businesses that are considered a little bit more risky for E-2 visa purposes. And one of these examples is real estate investments. So if you're investing in real estate and you're trying to use that as part of an E-2 visa application, that can have challenges because investing in real estate is often considered a passive investment. And definitely we would not recommend doing something like purchasing a property, real estate property, and then putting it in the name of an LLC and then using only that as part of your E-2 application and say, I invested in real estate and this is my business. Unfortunately, that kind of argument would not work at all for the purposes of the E-2 visa. And as Yongki mentioned before, one of the requirements of the E-2 visa eligibility is that you're coming in to develop and direct an active and operating business. Unfortunately, passive investments don't meet the test. So really the challenge is to demonstrate that you're investing in a real company that is going to be real and operating, providing actual goods or services, and not an idle speculative investment held only for potential appreciation in value. Similarly, the hiring of U.S. employees is a very important part of the E-2 visa program. So types of real estate companies that can work are things that are not just about, holding onto properties for appreciation, but if you're actually setting up a real estate brokerage firm and if you'll be hiring employees in that brokerage firm, or if you're setting up a real estate management company and you'll be, helping clients manage their own companies, and if you'll be hiring U.S. employees to help with that, or if you will be setting up a real estate renovation or construction company and doing this on a large scale for clients. That is kind of the more more viable types of businesses related to real estate that can work for E2 visa purposes, because those types of businesses are providing real services to clients as opposed to, just being an idle speculative investment. House flipping is also a very risky type of endeavor to apply for the E2 visa with. If you're just doing it on a small scale and really for your own personal benefit. So if you're buying a house or buying a couple of houses and say, I'm going to flip it and that's my business, it is risky and it may not work. Only on a large commercial scale, if you're doing that on a commercial scale, and if you'll be, hiring employees to help with that, for example, 30 to 40 properties, for example, maybe that is a different story. But a personal scale house flipping project would not be a recommended path for real estate investment based E2 visa purposes. All right, so now we'll move on and discuss equity trading companies, which is another risky type of endeavor to apply for an E2 visa with. So what are some considerations? It is important to note that placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC as an E2 investment will unfortunately not be enough to qualify for the visa. Day trading, personal investing for one's, for looking for appreciation in the asset's value. Unfortunately, that's also considered part of a more of a passive investment endeavor, as opposed to setting up a company that will provide goods and services in the economy in the way that the E2 visa program conceptualizes it. So if you are thinking of setting up an equity trading company and apply for an E2 visa on the basis of that, that company should go beyond just the realm of personal investing. So that company's clients should generally go beyond your immediate family or friends. And there should be enough scale of an activity that the government is convinced that this is an active business that provides goods or services to many different clients. Similarly, your business must have the potential to hire U.S. workers because that is pretty much the main point of the E2 visa program. Other things to note is that equity trading is a highly regulated industry. And if you don't have the required licenses to engage in that sort of activity, that may become a problem. So definitely investigate and do rigorous research before you apply to make sure that you have the right licenses. And importantly, for companies like this, as it was in the previous slide when we discussed real estate investments, you will need to convince a USCIS officer or a Department of State consular officer that your business is not a passive endeavor just for the generation of wealth for yourself, but is an active business that hires U.S. employees and provides goods and services to many different clients. All right, so now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some common reasons for E2 visa denials. So the first reason to think about is really the low investment amount, which is in fact a common reason why your case may be denied. There are ways to strengthen cases with lower investment amounts. But there are some instances where the officer will just see the low amount and ultimately may deny the case. If that is the case, and if your case has been denied because the investment amount was so low that the officer didn't think that it was substantial enough, you can take the strategy to spend more money and reapply. You can find other things that you can spend money on to really build the record of a more substantial investment. So definitely get in touch with us if you're working on a risky case. Oh, and another thing to mention again that could help is when you're reapplying based on a denial for a low investment amount, you can perhaps get an independent advisory letter from a CPA, and that CPA can confirm that everything related to, required to set up that type of business has already been secured, and the CPA can perhaps provide that independent opinion of substantiality. So that can be another way you can strengthen the application for the reapplication. Nature of the business. The nature of the business can be a factor on why an officer may deny the E-2 visa application. So, consulting types businesses, that's one risky aspect. If the officer would think that you're simply coming in to work as a solo consultant, for example, and you won't be hiring, employees to generate that job creation activity in the US if you're just coming in to, provide services by yourself, that can be seen as a type of activity that competes with the local labor market. So that can be a reason why an officer may be inclined to deny your case. Real estate investment is a risky nature business, as I mentioned in the previous slides. Equity trading businesses, we just went over that slide as well. Those are some riskier types regarding the nature of the activity. If a officer may not be familiar with a type of business, or if they don't think that it would be a viable and active business, a business plan would be key to explain how and why this can work. Filing location or venue can also be a factor that can lead to denial. You do need to know your venue. Different consulates have different ideas on what amount of investment is substantial, with some consulates being used to seeing much higher amounts than $100,000, while other consulates are used to seeing, more smaller business applications with a variety of types of endeavors. So definitely speak to attorneys that have that broad familiarity with the nuanced differences between consulates, and make sure to choose the right strategy that is tailored to the facts of your case. Another risk factor is when you have been running a similar business in your home country for a long time and you have never hired any employees. It may be more difficult to convince the officer that what will be different in this case in the United States, that you would actually hire employees when you get to the United States. So having a history of having had no employees in a solo-owned business can actually be a risk factor. One solution you can use when you're working with that kind of fact pattern is go ahead and hire an employee. Go ahead and hire a US employee even before you apply. And if you can bring the employment contract, you can bring copies of payroll, showing that you have been paying a US employee, even from abroad, even before you have obtained the actual visa, you can do that. And another benefit of doing that is any payments that you make to your employees can be used as part of your E-2 investment. So if you're struggling to raise the amount of the E-2 investment to meet the substantiality requirement, hiring an employee can be an excellent way to boost that amount, and also uh, assuage any concerns regarding your similar business in the home country not having had any employees. So, concern over whether the business will create jobs for US workers is a closely related concern. If the government will think that you're coming in and you'll just work as a solo practitioner, that can be a basis for denial of the case, because the government really expects the E-2 enterprise to be an active business that hires US employees. Hiring US employees really is the key point of the E-2 visa program. Conversely, if you're able to hire an employee even before you apply, that can proactively address such concerns. So that can increase the possibility that your E-2 application will be approved. Issues with adjudicating officer. It is rare, but definitely it has happened. So consular officers are human beings and they have a lot of discretion, and different consulars have different temperaments, and an officer can take a particular personal impression about your case, and sometimes that may not be easy to change those when they have made up their mind. It is always possible to reapply if you have been denied because of such reasons. It is likely that they will assign you to a different officer once you reapply. So that can be a way to move forward if that really was the reason for the denial. Finally, some stories of denials are just because the case simply did not meet the requirements at the time of filing. For example, if the company is not majority owned by treaty country nationals. That is a basic requirement, but if you didn't meet that, then that can be a reason for denial. Similarly, for substantiality, let's say maybe somebody actually spent only $2,000 and placed $78,000 in the business bank account and said, "Okay, I've invested $80,000." Unfortunately, that doesn't meet the requirements because the requirements is that the money should be placed at risk. And for that, we highly recommend having the majority of the amount being spent on concrete expenditures to satisfy that the investment really has been money placed at risk, as the regulations require. So if you simply did not meet the requirements at the time of filing, that can be a reason that the E-2 application is denied. Definitely get in touch with us, get in touch with attorneys that have profound expertise in the E-2 visa context, and you can reformulate the evidence and hopefully make a better impression for a future application. All right, so let's briefly go through some recent adjudication trends and some topics of how adjudication practices have changed over time. So currently, approval rates, government posted approval rates are at between 80 to 90%, and that includes, attorney prepared files, that includes self petitions. So really, it is a relatively high approval rate for the type of visa. Other types of visas have even lower approval rates. Scott Legal approval rates. We have a very high approval rate of 98%. Approximately 98%, and we've processed thousands of cases. So definitely you can see that attorney prepared files have a higher success rate than the government posted general approval rate. Again, note that past results do not predict future outcome, but we have had plenty of experience with the more riskier types of cases. There are some attorneys who do not take any case where the investment amount is below $100,000. But for Scott Legal, we have processed many cases on behalf of smaller businesses and have successfully processed them. So we do have the expertise and the nuanced understanding of what is required for a successful case, even for smaller businesses. Now, let's talk a little bit about timelines. Timelines vary quite widely between consulates. London and Toronto are the consulates that we file most frequently. And for London, we are seeing at least 90 business days to get a response from the consulate. Some lawyers are reporting even lengthier timelines of 6 to 7 months before getting an answer from the consulate. So London is taking quite long lately. Toronto, I would say less than 2 months from submission to interview. So Toronto timelines continue to be very reasonable. Generally, you would expect 3 to 4 months minimum for the processing case if you're applying for an E-2 visa at a U.S. consulate abroad. Now, USCIS versus consulate. So it is a possibility to apply to change status to E-2 from within the United States if you directly apply to USCIS. And for that, premium processing is available. So if you need an answer very quickly, E-2 change of status with USCIS, if you're already in the US on a different non-immigrant status, can be an option, very quick option, 15 calendar days with premium processing. You will need to pay more, of course, but that is an option. Other considerations when you're choosing between applying for a change of status versus applying for a E-2 visa at a consulate. USCIS can also be more lenient about the amount of investment. So we have seen approvals with significantly lower investment amounts than what we typically see at a visa application through a consulate. So that is one aspect that can help your case. However, there is a downside if you are applying through USCIS to change status. The downside is that a change of status to E-2 achieved through this USCIS application does not give you the ability to travel in and out of the US. You do need a visa to come back into the US on E-2 status if you travel outside. So That is one disadvantage of doing a USCIS change of status. The status change would only be valid for that particular trip that you are for as long as you're in the United States, and you can extend it for 2 years at a time. When you need to come back in, if you have to travel out after a change of status is approved, it'll still be a brand new E-2 visa application. It is not like an H-1B stamping appointment where you already have the petition approved. It's not like that. The U.S. consulate abroad will take the E-2 application as a brand new application. So you may need to go through the entire process, waiting the several months, and doing the interview again. And really re-advocating for yourself for eligibility before you can come back into the United States with the E-2 visa. So you may need to apply through the consulate anyway at some point. Let's see. The USCIS is also very strict about the source and trail of funds. USCIS looks for a dollar-to-dollar accounting on how the money was accumulated and then transferred over to the E-2 business. By contrast, consular officers take a more high-level approach on the source and trail of funds. So if you have a particularly complex source or trail of funds, it may be better to just apply at a U.S. consulate abroad rather than doing a change of status. So definitely speak to your attorney, have them review your documents before making the final decision on whether you want to go for the USCIS versus consulate. Now, post-specific considerations. So each consular post has slightly different procedures and slightly different requirements of what they want the applicant to submit. So some consulates ask for specific documents, such as a business plan certified by a CPA, such as Singapore and Mexico. Consulates in Mexico, they require that. So, and those requirements do change over time. So definitely speak to your attorney so that we can look at, the most relevant and recent instructions for that particular post. Consular preferences. So definitely, and I've mentioned this many times during the presentation, but some consulates expect higher investment amounts. And some examples of that are consulates in Japan and sometimes consulates in, South Korea and other consulates around there. You may want to invest more if you are planning to apply at those consulates. So definitely speak to a lawyer before you make the final decision. Other consulates may also expect that your business already have employees at the time of application. So definitely also reach out to us regarding that. And CPA certification, I already went over that in the previous bullet. All right, so issues in complex areas. What are some issues in complex areas to keep in mind for risky cases? So the first question is, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E-2 visa? The answer is no, not necessarily a regulatory requirement, but it can help your case, especially if your investment amount is low. And this question also depends a bit on the venue, how you're applying, where you're applying, and I touched over this in the previous slide. But let's say you're, applying through USCIS, for example. It can be a very important consideration to have the employee when you apply through USCIS. Just, because USCIS tends to scrutinize whether you'll be directing and developing the business as opposed to actually working in it, and, work authorization questions as well. So definitely it can have strategic importance to go ahead and hire an employee before you're applying. But the benefit of hiring the employee before you apply is also that you can include any payments that you make to the employee or any expenses related to setting up the payroll. You can include that in the investment amount, so it can help meet the substantiality requirement as well. Complicated source and trail of funds for USCIS filings. Sources of funds and trails of funds documentation can pose a challenge if you are trying to apply for a change of status from within the U.S. I already went over this in the previous slide. One thing to note is that it is possible to use loans or gifts as your source of funds for the E2 investment, but if it is a personal loan and if it is a gift, you have to go one step further and talk about where the loaner got that money or where the gifter got that money from. So you can't just avoid the source of funds requirement just by having it as a loan or a gift. And the other thing to note, a very important part, is that the loan cannot be secured by any of the assets of the E2 business, or the loan can't use the E2 business as the security. So it must be an unrelated secured loan, for example, your personal house or your personal vehicle or something like that, that is not related to the E2 business or the assets of the E2 business. So definitely remember that about loans. You do need to clarify what is exactly the collateral for the loan so that the government can see that it is not secured by any of the assets of the E2 business. It can be an unsecured loan. So if you buy something from your personal credit, that is considered an unsecured loan, and that should be okay. But yeah, definitely reach out to us for more specific guidance on that. E2 visas for two investors, it is possible if they are both treaty country nationals. Two investors can qualify for an E2 investor visa if they each own 50% of the company. But each person must meet the substantial investment requirement. So you can't just have one investor invest 80K and the other only invest 20K or things like that. It needs to be roughly equal, because each investor must independently meet the substantiality requirement for the investment. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So be very careful for changes in ownership, changes in types of business. One thing to note is that you need to maintain 50% or above ownership if you want to be continued to maintain E2 status. Substantial changes to the type of business after you got your visa need to be approved by the consulate. For example, if you set up a consulting company, you can't just, you know, suddenly pivot to a restaurant business. That's definitely not contemplated by the original business plan. And the other limitation is that when you're approved for E2 status, the E2 status, E2 visa will be tied to the specific E2 entity, the U.S. corporate entity, the LLC or the corporation that you set up, that you applied with the E2 visa for. So all of your employment should be through that E2 entity. The E2 entity is the only company that you should be working for. You can't, set up side hustles or just start setting up other LLCs or other corporations and start working for those different corporations because your work authorization is limited to the E2 entity. Definitely a very important limitation. You speak to your lawyer before start setting up other companies or consider adding different revenue streams, because we want to minimize risks of having have had a substantial change to your business after filing. Family business purchases is a risky endeavor because USCIS or the Department of State may think that it's not a real bona fide transaction. It is possible, technically, but you would definitely want to submit additional support that it is a fair market price that you paid to that family member. Perhaps an independent CPA evaluation that the business purchase price you paid is actually the fair market price. So a risky fact pattern for sure. Talk to your attorney before proceeding. Now, the last thing we will talk about is the impact of the new administration on E2 visa practice. So there has been some executive orders that may impact adjudicatory approaches. So for example, enhanced vetting, America First trade policy, and things like that, where the general priority of the administration is prioritizing creation of jobs for Americans. So those types of executive orders can affect E2 visa adjudication patterns. This may result in emphasis on investments that take place in the U.S. And U.S. job creation can be what they're really looking for. So it informs the strategies that you can consider when you're preparing an E2 visa case. Approval rates for E2 visas during the first Trump administration did not change much. many E2 visas are also still being approved under our practice. So definitely E2 visas are still very viable and very popular options for investors who want to develop and direct an enterprise in the United States. So definitely feel free to get in touch with us if you are interested in moving forward. All right.
Okay,
I
thank
don't,
you, Jie. That
thank
was
you.
very helpful presentation. We will take a look at whether there's any questions, but there is not. So thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.